ahead and get started. So again, good morning, afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Brenna Goggin, and I'm the Mid-Atlantic Leadership Development Manager for River Network. And today I'm joined by my colleague, Deanna Toledo, Leadership Development Director, who will be helping to manage the polls and bring my attention to your questions. Today's webinar is part 2 of the What, Who, and How of Nonprofit Advocacy Work webinar series. Advocacy 102, Boards plus Advocacy equals a winning strategy, builds upon the Yes You Can, Advocacy Basics for Beginners, a short that you can find on the River Network website. If you haven't already done so, be sure to register for the third and final in this webinar series, Advocacy 103, Planning plus Resources equals an Effective Campaign. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now.
Yes, Brenna, I can see it.
So the final training session, like I said, is Advocacy 103, Planning plus Resources equals an Effective Campaign, which will take place on November 12th at 1 p.m. As I mentioned earlier, for those that joined just a little bit before 1 o'clock, we are going to send a follow-up email with a link to register for the last and final webinar series, a follow-up survey that will help us to evaluate what types of trainings you're looking for and how we might improve upon this one, and then as well as a link to all of the handouts and a recording from today's presentation. So before we jump right in, for those that are new to River Network or just need a refresher on what we do, River Network provides access to proven best practices for coalitions, groups, and leaders to help them become effective, courageous, and sustainable champions for our waters. We have 4 strategic areas: clean, safe, affordable drinking water, resilient cities and communities, healthy rivers and agricultural landscapes, robust and effective water laws and policies. So why am I talking about advocacy today? Oops, let me go back. Before working with River Network, I served as the Director of Advocacy and External Affairs in Delaware. In that position, I was the only paid full-time staff person in the state working for a nonprofit on environmental policy issues. The main reason why I was the only one was because nonprofits feared what advocacy could open up for them as far as risk, or the idea that they couldn't do advocacy at all. I saw firsthand during my days in the State House how not having a collective group of environmental advocates was a detriment to the environmental policy and ultimately Delaware's natural resources. While legislators recognized me and could identify who I worked for without prompting, they also had no problem voting in direct opposition to what I was advocating for, because it was just me. While I was successful in bringing individuals down to meet with their legislators, it wasn't quote unquote ordinary individuals these legislators wanted to hear from. They much preferred hearing from powerful individuals and organizations within their districts. For that reason, and to begin building kind of what I saw as a collective group of advocates, I spent the last 5 years in my previous position working with local universities and adjunct professors to further educate and encourage nonprofits to get involved in the advocacy work. Now more than ever, it is critical for nonprofits to participate in advocacy so that they can do a deeper dive. Now more than ever, it's important for nonprofits to participate in advocacy. For that reason, we're going to do a deeper dive into why you should advocate, the different ways you can engage your board in your advocacy work, policies and procedures you can enact that promote advocacy activities while minimizing risk, and finally, how you can include advocacy activities in all levels of your organization. Nonprofits will use the words advocacy and lobbying interchangeably, but they do have very different definitions. Advocacy is defined as arguing in favor of a cause or an idea. Lobbying is any attempt to influence a politician, public official, or a member of the public on a specific piece of legislation. If you remember from the first webinar, the webinar short that we did on advocacy and lobbying, advocacy is not defined or regulated by the IRS, but lobbying is, and therefore has specific rules about what you can and cannot do. Now, I don't want to confuse you, but for today, and for today only, for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to use advocacy to describe both activities. So let's first, to get a sense of the organizations we have joining us today, I'd like to start by asking, does your organization participate in advocacy activities? Remember, for the purpose of this discussion, advocacy and lobbying are interchangeable. So if your organization conducts lobbying work legislatively or participates in advocacy activities, such as educating the public around issues, rulemaking, research and analysis, or litigation, please respond with yes.
Okay, and we've got folks are starting to vote. We've got a few folks that we still need to wait on. Give it a couple of seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And I think hopefully everybody can see 78% of you here said yes, your organization does advocate, and 22% said no. Back to you.
Interesting. So we're actually going to do a second poll question. So for those that responded in the positive, who in your organization does the advocating? While for today's presentation, we'll focus primarily on how your boards can help with advocacy work, the same principles that we review today will apply for the executive director and senior leadership and volunteers. So your options are executive director, board of directors, other staff and volunteers, I don't know, or we don't do advocacy yet. So for those that were in the 20%.
Okay, so votes are coming in. I'll just give it a few more seconds here. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So Brenna, 45% of our executive directors who are doing the advocacy. For 9%, the board of directors are also doing it. 18% say other staff or volunteers, and then 27% do not participate in advocacy activities.
Thank you.
So about half of them is the ED. Back to you.
So that's really interesting that only 9% of board of directors. So I'm hoping after today's presentation, the next time that we maybe do this next year, that 9% will at least double because your organization will see the value in having your board get more involved in advocacy. For the 27% of you that don't currently do advocacy, hopefully this webinar series will provide you with a good amount of background and information that will encourage your organization to reconsider. So it sometimes comes as a surprise to people in the nonprofit sector that we have the constitutional right and statutory authority to advocate and even lobby on behalf of our organizations and the individuals and communities we serve. In fact, charitable nonprofits can and absolutely should speak out on matters of public policy that affect their missions. In a recently released report by the National Council of Nonprofits titled Nonprofit Impact Matters, they state that nonprofits improve the lives of individuals, add vitality to American communities, contribute to local and national economies, and enhance the overall health of our democracy. If you're joining us today and you work for a nonprofit, none of this is news to you. However, what might be is that our ability to continue to make these improvements and have these substance impacts face challenges. All 501c3 organizations need a reliable, steady, and supportive public policy environment in which to pursue their missions. Advocacy is a great way to increase the reach of your organization while promoting good social policy, whether it is through increasing your presence in the media, think things like op-eds or letters to the editor, action alerts that promote your mission and goals while engaging your membership, or treating decision makers like donors. Advocacy is just one strategy to promote your organization. The Nonprofit Impact Matters goes on to say that nonprofit missions are vulnerable to actions by policymakers who, whether intentionally or inadvertently, can take away needed resources, impose unnecessary burdens, interfere with decision-making, erect harmful barriers, and otherwise change laws that disrupt the work of the charitable, religious, and philanthropic organizations. For instance, in Delaware, several years ago, the General Assembly got into a little bit of a tussle over the nonprofit organization's budget. We had an opportunity in Delaware every year to provide pass-through dollars, so state dollars, directly to nonprofits that were helping the community. As things go with party politics, nonprofit budgets became a debate on the floor, with one party suggesting that nonprofit budgets be zeroed out completely, and the other party obviously opposing that. Unfortunately, because so many nonprofit organizations in Delaware did not participate in advocacy efforts, they were completely caught unaware and unprepared for the zeroing out of the state dollars that would otherwise have come to them. In nonprofit world and advocacy, strength is in numbers. Nonprofits exist in every community, are closest to the problems, and understand the issues. In this case in Delaware, we had firefighters, EMTs, show up in force with their fire trucks, ambulances, and men and women in uniform to explain what the impact that zeroing out the nonprofit world in Delaware would have. What you didn't have was health advocates, environmental nonprofits, and educational systems showing up in force. And while we were successful ultimately in getting the budget renegotiated so it was not zeroed out, we should have been more prepared as a collective group in sharing our stories and our political will with policymakers. Board members are a tremendous asset and can be tremendous assets to your advocacy efforts. A resource I would encourage you to investigate if your board questions whether or not advocacy is right for the organization or even for them is the Stand for Your Mission campaign. I'll go into it a little bit more detail later in the webinar. But in order to engage in advocacy as a board member, you should reassure them that they don't have to be experts in advocacy, but they have relationships, knowledge, and skills that can directly benefit the organization. So why board members? The reason that board advocacy is so powerful is because of who the board member is. They are a board member. That automatically gives them a distinction. They are volunteering their time to be engaged, an influential member of the community, which is likely why you invited them to be part of your board. And they vote. So even better for a legislator. Board members have the opportunity to make it personal. They can share why it is that they volunteer their time or donate their money to their organization and its mission, and explain why and the impact that it has on the constituents for those decision makers. That's the story that a legislator will remember. You have to make sure that your board member can connect the dots. Does your organization provide a local government, a state or federal government Vital services that otherwise, if your organization were to go away, would no longer exist. Is there a policy decision, or in the example that I provided, a budgetary implication that could either positively or negatively impact your organization? Is there an administrative regulation that is standing in the way of a good solution? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then this is where telling a legislator can be very helpful. Remember, decision makers are, in theory, put into office to help you. And so by explaining to them how they can do so that doesn't necessarily impact the pocketbooks can be a very impactful statement. And then if you are a board member listening to this, I want to emphasize that it's always important that you are coordinating with the staff and organization. You want to make sure that you are being consistent in your message and not conflicting one another in your strategy. Again, a board member doesn't need to make a major commitment of time to effectively engage in advocacy. Sometimes the very nature of who they are and how they are connected can be helpful in speeding up advocacy efforts and making them more successful. There is no better way for board members to learn than to throw them into the deep end and get them involved. Maybe with a raft. Encourage board members to get involved by attending fly-ins, press events, bill signings, legislative meetings, or hearings that allow them to see on-the-ground advocacy. Attend an advocacy lobby day with other nonprofits at your state capitol or in the nation's capital in order to build relationships with those decision makers or their staff. Meet with public officials at their office or even better, at your site to share your insights, introduce them to the organization, and explain the impact that you have on their community. Write an op-ed or a letter to the editor informing the broader community about how your organization has an impact and what services you provide. Other ways that board members can make a difference in a relatively short amount of time is to get a phone call returned. If you as staff have been trying to get decision makers to respond and they're just not picking up the phone or returning that call, perhaps ask your board member to make that call instead and to connect them with the appropriate person. Encourage attendance. Have your board send personal invitations to elected officials if you're attending or putting together an educational town hall or an event. Having that board member make that personal invitation might make a difference in getting them to attend. Going either further, if there's a decision maker that you want to get a meeting with, but you don't know if your title or your organization resonates necessarily with the work that they're working on, a board member can be a real asset in whether or not that meeting takes place and how it goes. So I wanted to give a little bit of a case study. For organizations that are beginning their advocacy work, one recommendation I always give is to think about joining a regional coalition or a national organization like River Network that can help teach, guide advocacy efforts, or provide critical resources that you will then have access to. So the two organizations I want to talk about today, one is West Virginia Rivers Coalition, which is an organization founded by paddlers and whitewater enthusiasts that believes clean water is the foundation of life and that all people should respect and be able to enjoy West Virginia's rivers and streams. National Wildlife Federation is America's largest conservation organization working across the United States to unite Americans to give wildlife a voice. So why am I focusing on these two organizations today? Individually and without each other, they would be limited in the type of work that they would be able to do that would directly impact their missions. In the case of West Virginia Rivers Coalition, they saw devastating disasters in 2014 and 2015 as it related to water quality, with hazard chemical spills into the Elk River impacting 300,000 people's drinking waters over 9 counties, and then a train derailment and a diesel spill. Alone, they probably would have been able to capitalize on those events and bring out people to talk about the impacts of industry on water quality. However, as an affiliate of the National Wildlife Federation, in an emergency situation, they were able to tap into the expertise of the Federation's staff, as well as help fundraise and use their donor base to specifically build the staff and board capacity for the organization to increase their impact across the state. Likewise, National Wildlife Federation as a national organization would have been received probably with skepticism had they come in and tried to work as a national federation in West Virginia. However, by using the affiliate relationship, they were able to funnel resources and expertise through the coalition into the communities themselves to help directly positively impact water quality measures in the state of West Virginia. Now, together, these two organizations meet on an annual basis in DC to lobby on behalf of positive environmental regulation, as well as the Chesapeake Bay budget, because believe it or not, parts of West Virginia do flow into the Chesapeake Bay. And West Virginia Rivers Coalition is able to attend an annual National Wildlife Federation annual meeting to discuss what the Federation's priorities will be in the coming year. Collectively, they have been able to maximize their resources and their expertise and approach issues in a collective fashion. Would they have had such an impact nationally and in the state if they had worked on policy alone? Sure, but with their reach and effectiveness increased because they partnered with each other and were able to work on both federal policy as well as state and local issues. So now that we've hopefully, for those 20% odd, 20 odd percent, provided you with adequate reasons to begin conducting more advocacy work, I want to talk a little bit more about training options that are available for your board and senior leadership. So how many of you have participated in some type of advocacy training previously? Yes, no, or I don't know.
All right, votes are coming in, Brenna. Let me just give it a few more seconds. We've got just over half of the folks have voted. All right, I'm gonna close this down, and it looks like exactly 2/3 of folks have attended a training and 33% or a third have not. Back to you.
Excellent, thank you, Deanna. I would be curious if people are able to see the chat option, and I see that some people have been typing questions, so that's great. Which trainings they have participated, because I think it's always helpful to share with other people what trainings, and I would only share those trainings if you would recommend them necessarily. So for those of us that are on the webinar that have not, so the third that have not attended a training, it might be helpful to see what other people put in as far as trainings that they would recommend. I'll go over a couple today, but would be interested to see what other people have to recommend. So the first and foremost, and probably one that most people are familiar with, is the Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy trainings. Boulder Advocacy is made up of lawyers, coaches, and nonprofit experts with one big goal: to make advocacy easy and accessible to nonprofit and foundation leaders who want to be great fighters for their cause. Boulder Advocacy is a program of the Alliance for Justice, a national association of 130 organizations. And you can see they have two upcoming trainings that I thought you guys might be interested in that tie directly to this issue that we're discussing. So in addition to sharing this webinar and the handouts provided, you can also feel free to share the two upcoming trainings that are being put together by Alliance for Justice. As I mentioned earlier in the webinar, Another great resource, especially for those specific to board of directors, is Stand Your Mission campaign. The Stand Your Mission campaign is a challenge to all nonprofit decision makers to stand up for their organizations they believe in by actively representing their organization's missions and values and creating public will for positive change. Initiated by BoardSource, a recognized leader in nonprofit board leadership that supports, trains, and educates nonprofit leaders from across the country and throughout the world. They are a 501c3 organization who has joined with the Alliance for Justice, the Camp Beyond Foundation, the National Council of Nonprofits, and the United Philanthropy Forum to develop the Stand Your Mission campaign. The Stand Your Mission campaign is to unleash the full potential of the nonprofit sector to create positive impact by engaging board leaders more directly in the advocacy work of their organizations. According to the Stand for Your Mission, and I would encourage you to check out their website, they have 3 critical roles that board members can play in advocacy. One is strategy, helping the organization to be the most effective advocates they can be. 2 is budget and resources, making sure that funding is secure to promote and properly resource your advocacy work. And 3, the one that we've touched on the most today, personal engagement, using the relationships that you have as a board of director to secure results, support staff, and offering to pen letters to the editor or op-eds. Check out standforyourmission.org for additional information, including trainings, toolkits, and case studies. In addition to the 2 that I've listed, there are also a number of entities that offer trainings for staff and board members new to the idea of advocacy, or want to make sure that their level of knowledge is in tip-top shape. Please feel free to share these resources and upcoming trainings with your colleagues, even if you're not a board member yourself. Now that we have reviewed the why of advocacy and trainings available, let's move to the policies I would recommend organizations adopt when considering conducting advocacy and lobbying activities. Let's start by asking you another question of how many organizations have policies in place regarding advocacy?
All right, I've opened up the poll. Let's give it a minute.
And I promise this is the last question. Ooh,
all right. I'm going to go ahead and close it down. So Brenna, for your benefit, 22% of respondents do have board approved policies related to advocacy. 22% do not, and over half of the folks do not know whether or not they have them. Back to you.
Ooh. So one item that I would encourage folks to do for those 50% that don't know, that is one thing that you can do very quickly following this webinar, is to figure out what policies, board approved policies you have in place for advocacy or not, because this next section will focus on those policies, and this will help you to figure out which ones maybe you would make the most sense to implement within your organization. Thank you to John Carter for calling out a civil disobedience training that he took regarding advocacy. It would also be helpful if folks could tell me what policies they might have at their organization. For those 22% that says that they have board approved policies regarding advocacy, what are those policies in reference to? So one question was, do you mean policies for staff or for the board themselves? It could be either. The policy is regarding the advocacy work, regardless of who might be doing it. So some of the policies that we're going to go over, just to give you an idea, is a conflict of interest policy, sign-on letters, developing a position statement, who can speak for the organization. So when I'm talking about policies, the board has reviewed that and they have voted on it. So for the 22% that said that they do have policies, I'd be curious to know what those policies are, if you have a chance to put it into your chat box. So while we're waiting for that, I'm going to go over a couple that I would recommend that your organization have. The first and foremost, and probably the one that's most understood, is conflict of interest policy. While that's pretty self-explanatory just by its title, I want to make sure that we quickly review what it means when we're referring to a conflict of interest policy. So according to the Council of Nonprofits, the conflict of interest policy governs, not surprising, conflicts of interest that a board can adopt. To have the most impact, they recommend that the policy should be in writing, and the board and staff should review that policy directly and regularly. A policy on conflicts of interest should require those with a conflict or who they think might have a conflict to disclose that conflict or potential conflict. And yes, they put all of these conflicts all in one sentence. And prohibit interested board members from voting on any matter in which there could be a conflict. It's important to also see if your state has local provisions regarding what could be included in a conflict of interest. New York, for example, has a different policy than the federal one, so you want to make sure that your organization is responsive to both. So what do I mean about representing the nonprofit organization? Well, with advocacy, some of the activities that we've gone over, like meeting with legislators or penning an op-ed, you want to make sure that everyone in your organization, board, staff, volunteers, understand who is allowed to represent your organization. Do you want to keep it in-house and limit it to just staff and board? Or do you want volunteers to be able to speak on behalf of the organization? And if so, when is that most appropriate? Making sure that that's in writing and as part of any orientation for board or volunteers will be important as you move forward with your advocacy work. Very similarly, figuring out when is it appropriate for someone to represent the organization. Is it just at public hearings? Is it just at organizational events? Or do you want it to go further and have people have your name associated with them in the media or at testimonies in hearings? These are all things to consider, and I would tell you that the National Council of Nonprofits, the link that I included here, has a great resource specific to conflicts of interest. Very
Brenna,
similar.
I'm wondering if you might, can I jump in? There's a question here that might be helpful. Can you repeat the definition again of advocacy? Wasn't sure if it was included in the handouts. So can you backtrack a little bit as we're talking about these policies, and how are you defining advocacy?
So remember the purpose. So, all right, let me answer the first question. The definition of advocacy is defined as arguing in favor of a cause or an idea. Lobbying is any attempt to influence a politician, public official, or a member of the public on a specific piece of legislation. For today's webinar and for the content that we're talking about, I'm using those words combined as advocacy. So whether it's your lobbying activities or it's just your advocacy work, all of that should be encompassed under advocacy for today. Does that make sense to whoever asked that question?
Yeah, if there's Tally, if there's a follow-up question, please go ahead and post it on the chat box. Thanks. Thank you, Brenna.
Yeah. And Tally, that stuff is in the first webinar as well, that you can find on the website that we're going to send you following this webinar. So you'll have that link that you can refer back to on all of that, if that's helpful. Oh, so there's another suggestion to Rise Up. Conducted a training in Southern Utah. That one looks to be not Rise Up. Oh, Wasatch Rising Tide, who ran the training. So that's another training opportunity for folks to take. So if you decide that you are going to get involved in advocacy and you want to start developing position statements, or if you're part of these regional or national coalitions that we described, earlier, sign-on letters are another tool that organizations use. Before doing either one of those things, you might want to figure out who can develop the position statement, what is going to be entailed, and what constitutes a position statement. So, are these emails that are going to go to Department of Environmental Protection personnel, articles submitted for publication in a newspaper, letters to a governor or legislators, or is a position statement only a statement made during agency, legislative, or judicial proceedings? So defining what that position statement is number one. Number two is who gets the final approval? Who can initiate the process? The executive director working with a committee or supported by staff to study various environmental issues and if need be to articulate proposed positions and public statements for the board's consideration. Is it just the staff or the executive director? How? What is the process your organization has put into place for developing and improving a position statement? Does it have to be approved by the board? Is it just approved by the executive director with information to the board? How flexible do you want to allow this process to be? When? When is the process initiated? Is it when someone suggests that we should have a position internally or externally, or a request from a decision maker that the organization develop one? As I mentioned, for organizations that are affiliated with national organizations or regional coalitions like Healing Our Waters or Choose Clean Water or the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed, sign-on letters are a common advocacy practice. Oftentimes, sign-on letters are used to show the diversity of groups that believe in an issue, like the protection of freshwater wetlands and the Clean Water Rule. They can be used in a regulatory fashion or a response to legislation, both at the state and federal levels. But oftentimes, organizations don't have a process in place for how they should sign on to these letters, or even if they should. So some questions for people to consider are, do you even participate in the sign-on letter process? Do you share the views that are expressed in this letter? Does it relate to your mission? And do you want to be affiliated with the other organizations that are signing on to that letter? Again, in the handout section, there's a whole page dedicated just to sign-on letters that will go into greater detail for you to questions that you should ask yourself about whether or not to participate in that practice. So as I mentioned earlier, I worked for an environmental nonprofit in Delaware before moving over to River Network. In this particular organization, back in the early 90s, the executive director at the time recognized that advocacy was not an area of expertise for him, and so he requested that the board develop an advocacy committee. In that committee, its members are appointed by the board, and their stated purpose, as spelled out in the committee's manual, is to advise the board and staff on environmental issues and suggest steps to address them. In this case, the committee has a structure and a clearly defined role to avoid conflict or diverging opinions of the staff. Remember, you want a unified voice for your organization. The committee, working with the staff, developed annual priorities that legislators, administrative decision makers, and partnering organizations would together work on. Once those priorities were defined, they would be sent to the board for final approval and referred during board meetings. Our committee met on a quarterly basis, but it is your choice as to when and how often your committee will meet. In the case of this organization, having a committee was incredibly helpful to getting our advocacy work up and running. I would suggest that if for those organizations that have done advocacy or are considering doing advocacy, creating a committee made up of board members, volunteers, and other expertise can be incredibly helpful when determining and putting into place a lot of these policies and practices that we've discussed today. On hindsight, I wish we would have developed a job description for committee members so that we could further hone in their expertise in areas of interest. I would encourage you to develop a job description for your committee members, similar to ones that you may already have in place for board members, that will help you to identify and fill in gaps of your staff knowledge area, whether it be energy, climate, legislative expertise, regulatory expertise, etc. BoardSource has a great resource on advisory councils titled 9 Keys to Success, and that's one of the handouts I've included. These are, we've already touched on, but include giving the council and committee the time and resources that they need. Yes, it is a committee, so it is going to need a staff person to staff it and probably to help run it. Make sure that they know exactly what it is that you want them to accomplish. So having a stated mission as part of the committee that is kept on all committee documents would be helpful. Finding the right members, making sure that you have the expertise that you need. Providing an orientation manual or a program, just like you would for a board of directors, so that they understand their role, how the organization's process works, especially as it relates to developing position statements or participating in sign-on letters, or more importantly, who speaks for the organizations. Make sure that when your committee is meeting, that you're making these meetings meaningful and interactive, and you create additional opportunities for engagement separate from these meetings. Take them to public hearings with you. Take them to meetings on the Hill. Have them help you write letters to the editor, whatever speaks to their expertise. Provide opportunities for evaluation and check-ins. With our committee in Delaware, we had an annual meeting that was dedicated just to the committee. We served some snacks and hors d'oeuvres, but most importantly, we reflected on the year past. What were we able to accomplish? What didn't we accomplish that we need to make sure is on the list in the next year? What were our challenges? What were our successes? And let's raise a glass to those. And then be open to disbanding the committee or council if it no longer serves its function. In this case, in the organization that I worked for, the Advocacy Committee had been around since 1990. It still served its purpose because as the only staff person, I couldn't be everywhere. And so the committee members would help by attending hearings and participating in public events on the organization's behalf.
A question came in, Brenna. So somebody writes that their organization has a policy that only the CEO and president, I think it's one position, and the policy director are allowed to advocate as they are defining that today. And so this person asks, is there any role that other staff should advocate for? And can such an organization have a policy related to what staff can do on their own time, not representing the organizations, but representing themselves as community members?
So let me make sure that I understand, because that was kind of a long question, Deanna. So the first is that the organization has a policy that only the executive director can participate in advocacy efforts on behalf of the organization. So is there anything that staff that work for that organization should advocate for in terms of changing that policy?
Yes, it's in terms, I think it's in terms of expanding their own role regarding advocacy.
Absolutely. I think it's completely an appropriate conversation. If your organization is already actively engaged in advocacy efforts, to see if having only one person do it has been effective, and if it would make sense for other staff to take on some of those roles and responsibilities. The more folks are engaged in this effort, the greater the expertise will be across the organization, and the more ingrained in the culture of the organization it will become. So I would encourage this person to speak to their supervisor directly, and if that supervisor happens to be the executive director, all the better, about what opportunities there could be for participating in advocacy activities for folks outside of the executive director, and if that would be worth taking to the board to change that policy, if that's a board policy that states only the executive director can do so.
Great. So another related question to that, Brenna, that this person asks is, and I don't know if you've ever seen organizational policies that either discourage or encourage or in any way define what staff can do outside of their working hours related to advocacy.
Sure. I personally had an unwritten rule that regulated when I worked in Delaware for what work I could do outside of the organization. The main reason was Delaware is such a small state that my volunteering my time and services on a political campaign, for instance, was strongly discouraged because I see all 42 legislators in the state house for 6 months out of the year. So it would be very uncomfortable and could provide difficulty for the organization if I worked on a campaign and that person lost. And so there was it was, like I said, a clear but unwritten rule that I was not to work on political campaigns while serving in that role. But outside of that, the political campaigns is the only one that I've heard that people, that organizations get a little touchy on, especially if you're working at the local level and your organization is well known within that community. By default, if you are representing the organization 9 times out of 10, and suddenly you're on the campaign trail of a candidate, then they're going to start associating you with that candidate, and that can cause a couple of gray areas for the organization and for you. So I would encourage, especially as it relates to election activities, Alliance for Justice does offer up a 1-800 number that folks can call to ask their questions free of charge. So if that's where you're going, that would be a resource I would recommend. Any other questions, Deanna?
No, that's it.
Okay. So I want to recap because we did cover a lot of ground today in a short period of time, and I want to make sure that we end this webinar on time. But I want to just review really quickly some important takeaways from today's webinar. One, by now I hope that you have been convinced that nonprofits can lobby and should use all of the tools in their toolkit to address their mission areas, whether that be direct lobbying or advocacy, or in this case, both. There are a number of resources and trainings that are available to nonprofits and their staff and board on what you can and cannot do as far as advocacy and lobbying activities, how specifically board members can be involved, and then the policies and procedures you can incorporate into your organization that will promote advocacy while at the same time protecting your organization. There are simple ways to include your board in advocacy efforts, including helping to build relationships with elected officials, helping with fundraising to sustain and enhance your advocacy efforts, developing a standing programmatic committee that will help advise staff and volunteers on advocacy work, and promote the organization's mission to decision makers. For those of you that work for organizations that do not currently participate in advocacy efforts, you are not alone. But I would encourage you in whatever capacity you feel comfortable in doing to help be an advocate for your organization getting more involved. Whether it's joining a local or regional coalition that does advocacy efforts instead of your organization doing it directly, sending our webinar and training opportunities to your director or board so that they can begin to get educated on how to properly and effectively do advocacy, or participating in these trainings yourself. One item that I would recommend for those that said that they don't know if their organization has policies is today or this week, set a goal of finding out what those policies are and where you can find them so that you can reference them. And if you're interested in doing advocacy, highlight them as resources for other staff in your organization. As I mentioned, this is a series, so if you haven't already, check out the first webinar short, the Advocacy 101, Yes You Can for Beginners. That will provide greater detail on the definitions that we went over today around advocacy and lobbying and what organizations can and cannot do. And then also take a moment now to register for the third and final series, Advocacy 103, where we'll do a really deep dive in campaign planning. This webinar will take place on November 12th. Finally, I want to make a shameless plug for you to become, if you're not already, a member of River Network. Why should you become a member? Well, River Network and these trainings that we are offering are provided because of the dues that we receive from paid membership. If you appreciated this webinar and any of the other resources that we provided, and most importantly, if you would like to attend our annual conference, River Rally, you consider becoming a paid member for River Network today and get discounts. So for those that don't know about River Rally is River Network's national annual conference. Approximately 500 river and water champions representing nonprofits, academia, government, foundations come together for 3 days of education, inspiration, and celebration. I want to thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. And again, I hope you will help us to improve our trainings and consider what additional trainings we should offer by completing the survey that we will provide in the follow-up email to this webinar. Thank you again for taking the time, and we hope to see you again on November 12th for the third and final training on campaign planning.
Brenna, one last question. If folks want to hang on to hear that one, is perhaps this will be covered in the next session, but I'm curious about the approach an organization should take when talking with decision makers who generally agree with the position of the organization versus ones that generally do not. I don't know if this is something that you'll cover at the next session, or if there's a resource that you can point folks to.
So we won't do a terribly deep dive into that in the campaign planning specific to decision makers, but we are going to talk about messaging and influencers. So for those that agree with what you're talking about, providing them with talking points and backup information so that they can share that information with their colleagues, as well as use your talking points on the floor or in correspondence to their constituents is always incredibly helpful. For those that may disagree with your position, do you have someone else in your organization or affiliated with your organization that might be a better messenger? And I think the first question that you would ask yourself is, are they movable in that decision? If you think that you can convince them to change their position, then finding the right messenger, someone that is in their inner circle or someone that's a huge constituent of theirs, whether it be a labor union or a small businessman or woman, might be a strategy that you could consider. If they're not movable, then in my experience, it's not necessarily worth the political capital to try to convince them to change their minds.
All right, and I think that's the last of the questions, Brenna. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and anyone else, if you have questions, you'll get an email from me, but you can always email me at bgoggin, Goggin, @rivernetwork.org. Thank you guys very much